Welcome to the Millionaire Next Door podcast with Robert Curtis, CFP, accredited investment fiduciary from Signature Estate and Investment Advisors. In this podcast, we help successful wealth accumulators like you looking to transition to a work-optional lifestyle by helping you build strategies for growing and maintaining your wealth. Robert draws from years of experience and fiduciary responsibility and interviews guest experts to help you build reliable strategies to grow and maintain your wealth. Now, on to the show.
Hello, welcome to the Millionaire Next Door podcast. We're so pleased you're here for another conversation. We're trying to have conversations here that really matter. And I've invited a guest on to speak today that I think will be absolutely terrific. I wanted to give you a little background on how this came about. A very big and important part of my practice is working with families, often intergenerationally. I've been doing this 27 years now. I've got second, third generation clients. It's really satisfying when we can connect the generations, or even for wealth transfer or having them share their thoughts, their legacies, their values, and working across 2 or 3 generations just brings a whole new level to it. And I think it serves clients really well. On to our guest. I heard our guest is Natasha Kennedy. I tuned in and heard a webcast that she presented on this very topic, covering it very deeply. And she presented it so well. And I agreed with so many of the points and thought, this is what I'm trying to say or articulate. I think I largely do a pretty good job at that. But boy, she said it so well. Boy, I'd love if she was on my team and we were interacting and she was helping clients. But she did it so well. I said, I have got to get this person on my podcast to share this. So that's what she's doing. It's Natasha Kennedy. Welcome, Natasha.
Thanks so much, Robert. And thanks for the kind words. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. I read through your bio and background, and you were on Wall Street for a number of years and leveraged finance and Barclays, and you worked for First Trust. And I believe one of the things you just finally uncovered was technical skill alone is simply not enough. True success depended upon the ability to connect and communicate and build trust. That resonated a lot with me, especially post-COVID. There was all this emphasis on technical skill, but a lot of just bedside manner and interacting with folks. And it's just huge. So I don't know if you want to introduce yourself further. I know you are a mental health therapist, right? So you've transitioned out of that, but there's surprisingly a large amount of overlap, as sometimes we both know. But let me let you introduce yourself and maybe launch into a little bit of your message and what you'd like to share with folks. And I really appreciate you being here.
And now, of course, you got it exactly right. I began my career working on a trading floor at Barclays, covering institutional clients. And then I worked as a client portfolio manager with First Trust, working very extensively with financial advisors. And naturally, that experience all inspired me to become a clinical mental health therapist today. And I think while it may sound like an unusual path, it's really given me a full 360-degree view of what wealth really means for people, not just dollars, but the decisions, identity, emotional legacy, all these messy things that sneakily get wrapped up into this blanket concept of money. And so when I come across a topic like family legacy planning, something that brings together financial strategy, human behavior, generational impact, that's when I know that I've really found work that sits at the intersection of what's really meaningful, at least for me.
Yeah, I've found myself at the same point. It's just tremendously more satisfying. As great as it is to work with individuals and clients and maybe spouses, but a lot of times when you're touching that third or second or third generation, it just feels so much more meaningful. It can also impact how we might manage the money, but just making sure that their legacy, those values are carried through. Some folks seem to really get it, want to share that and bridge that for the next generation. Some are challenged or don't want to face it or want to delay it or run into obstacles. So I'm always trying to keep that in mind, full circle. I have a family. I have children that are 23 and 20. So, that starts to play out. They have a grandmother who's there, that whole intergenerational. It's just really fascinating. But yeah, please keep going here.
No, it is. And it's more rewarding too, I think, for financial advisors who are working with families when they can see wealth passed down through the generations. And I think, just it could be helpful taking a step back here. What are we really talking about when we say wealth transfer? I mean, we hear about the great wealth transfer all the time, but what does it actually mean? So by the year 2048, which is crazy to think about, so just over 20 years from now, it's projected that 124 trillion will move from baby boomers to the next generation. And of that, just over 100 trillion will go directly to heirs. So that means more than half of all household wealth in the US will be changing hands within the next 2 decades. And, when we talk about the kids in quotes, we're not talking about toddlers here. We're talking about adult inheritors. We're talking about people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s who will suddenly find themselves responsible for managing significant wealth that they didn't build. And in many cases, weren't taught how to handle. And where it gets really interesting and risky is the idea that, 87% of inheritors say that they plan to use a financial advisor during the wealth transfer. But 9 out of 10, so 90%, do not even consider their family's financial advisor when deciding who to work with. And that's huge, right? That almost 90% of inheritors will have a financial advisor. They're telling us that. I do want guidance. I do want help with managing my money. But 90% of them also don't even consider the advisor that's been working with their family. And so clearly there's a huge gap there. They're actively choosing to work with someone else other than the person that their parents have clearly trusted. So we're essentially watching the most financially prepared generation, which is the boomers, pass wealth to the least prepared generation, or generations, I should say, largely millennials and Gen Z. And it's not because younger generations are disinterested or incapable. It's because there's been this breakdown in education, breakdown in communication between these generations. So it's really, and it's really not that, I was just going to say, it's really not that the lack of preparation is the next generation's fault. It's not. It's just the result of this gap that no one has intentionally taken the time to close.
Yeah, for sure. I hear those statistics all the time. I'm well aware of it. And I guess I could be on both sides of that. I mean, I really try and engage those families. Sometimes I'm working with kids in their adult kids in their 20s, 30s, getting to know them. You mentioned these inheritors in their 50s. I mean, I have a woman who just, late 60s just inherited from my eldest client passed away last year in December at 103, single man. So all of it went to her. I was already working with her, so it was already an easy transition. Other times I'll get introduced to someone who is coming into some funds, in several months or within a year or two, and they want to prep up for that. So we do try and engage. And I remember picking up years ago, early in my career, core client. They both passed, the husband and wife, rather quickly, and went on to his adult son. It was, he's about 61. But, we started working together. But just seeing that, I think there's something to understanding those values, knowing how he built it. Sometimes if they were more the wealth creators too, I just think there's a nice legacy, but it's not necessary, but it's there. And then some clients really they strive for that. They want me to reach out. They want to connect with the kids and adult kids, and they just want them to have that. So they're not left totally clueless. And all the other side of it I'll mention too, is just with husband and wife, there can be this, it's not uncommon, a dynamic where one of the spouses is, that's their area. That's what they deal with. So we deal much more with them and, very little, oftentimes the male, but with the wife, or she's not interested or money is not her thing. I mean, that's not uncommon to hear. I'll really make a point to try and interact with them as much as I can because things can change either through a passing or an incapacity or, I like, hey, your name's on the trust as well. So, we should really be talking here. You're one of the trustees. I'll try and make it easy, but just so they, sometimes you really have to kind of work to make that occur because there's resistance, but you're like, I think there'd be a lot of power in us having a relationship and knowing each other and feeling comfortable, before there's ever, sort of an immediate need that forces that. But back to you.
Right. No, I mean, what you're saying really makes sense in the fact that people tend to avoid these conversations. And sometimes there is a lot of resistance to being brought in. And that's why this whole dynamic exists, right? It's not that clients are not very smart people. They know that the wealth transfer conversations are important. They're not intellectually difficult to have. Inherently, we all understand how important they are. But what they are is emotionally complex. These conversations, they aren't avoided because we're uninformed or we don't get it, but they're avoided because they have the potential to be messy. But what's interesting is that more often than not, they actually create a massive sense of relief for everyone involved. And sometimes too, they force us to face the uncomfortable truth that we don't like thinking about, right? Our own mortality, our children's limitations, our parents' limitations, our family dynamics, which may not be as healthy as we'd hope, fears of being judged, misunderstood, rejected, right? And you alluded to this, I think, Robert, at the beginning. All of these human tendencies get really wrapped up in this wealth transfer. And that's what prevents the conversations and the frameworks from actually being discussed.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me having seen this, a lot. I mean, I'll get some families or say the patriarch he'll kind of lead with this and make that transition. And I'll let him know that that's the right thing to do. That is so mature, sophisticated. This is your estate, your legacy. You're passing that on. You get that. You're being really mature. And usually they don't realize how special that is. They sort of say, well, that's what we need to do. And they do it. I get other folks who just won't go that, or they'll talk about it. I've got one who's been trying to set it up with his adult daughter for months. I keep bringing, hey, I'll make myself available. This is really important. We should do this. Hopefully we're going to do that the holidays. And one that really stood out, I'll just throw it out there, but maybe you could get a little bit more into some of the dynamics. It was a newer client I had just engaged. So we're just trying to kind of get him on board. He's a retired cardiologist and he had a really large estate. I mean, we're talking like $20 million or so. And right in the first conversation, it was introduced by another advisor. I shared, we should get into the transitional. He's 79 years old, in good health, but still 79, with a family he loved and cared about. We should start thinking about that. If that's, kind of that would be part of our value proposition. And we have a process for that. And so his response was, well, let's not worry about that now. I just want you to make money. I want you to perform, do all this. And which is never what we lead with anyways. But I'm thinking, my goodness, he's a former cardiologist. I mean, if anybody understands life and death and somebody on the table every day and things just happening, sudden cardiac arrest. I mean, so he wasn't ready to face it. He sort of paused and kind of acknowledged, but he wasn't ready. So, we'll bring that up again when he's ready and the time is right. But I feel like I'm not doing him or his family or his legacy a full service if we can't. But they have to be. What do they say? When the student's ready, when the student's ready, the teacher will appear, kind of thing. So he just resisted. He resisted pretty strong. Kind of gave me I understand all that, but that's not what I'm need to do right now. And I was like, okay, I think, at any rate, it's just an interesting way of looking at things. So you probably see a lot of that. And, it's just, it's interesting.
Right. No, it is. And it's because, again, these conversations, they're emotional and they're uncomfortable. And I really like what you said that you're doing your clients essentially a disservice if you're not opening up the space for them to have these conversations, especially for advisors today where the landscape is more competitive than ever.
Hmm.
Fees are getting compressed. You need to earn your fee, right? You can't simply manage wealth. You have to have a practice where you're helping people actually have conversations that are important to them. And there is certainly resistance. That's why this dynamic exists and why some of the statistics, like 90% of kids leave their family's financial advisor, and only 13% of advisors are reaching out to their
Mm,
clients' children. It's crazy. And so it's just avoided everywhere. And there are so many reasons, right? We touched on a few of them earlier. I mean, just silence around it generally too, right? Many parents today didn't grow up in homes where money was discussed openly, so
mm,
they unintentionally pass that silence on to their children. They don't model financial transparency. They don't know how to talk about wealth without conflict or guilt or shame or whatever it might be that's associated with it for them. Or they think it's better not to talk about it, right? Until it's too late. And that silence essentially becomes a legacy in and of itself. It's one that creates confusion and a lack of trust. And it can even create resentment, but it's not coming from bad intentions. It's almost as though there's this thought, I think, that, silence is neutral, but it's really not neutral. It's interpreted. It doesn't feel like safety to the next generation. It feels like secrecy, right? And it breeds stories in your mind. Maybe they don't trust me. Maybe there's no plan. Maybe I'm not getting anything. No one's on the same page. And when there's no communication, people naturally just fill in the blanks for themselves. And it could be with a scenario that's much worse than the reality.
yeah, for sure. I a side thought when you mentioned this big transitional shift, 124 trillion. I mean,
Hmm.
naturally, part of our goal would be to have that as little as possible go to the government, unless they voluntarily donated that. But nobody
Right.
wants that I've come across. So, but also the legacy and the values, and sometimes when you see these folks who maybe were, self-created or built their own wealth, or, some of which do pretty well, but they're still kind of frugal, they're not big spenders. Maybe they were, out of the Depression era or post, they're just not big
Sure.
spenders, but so to have that, to let them know the value of the work, they know how their parents did that, but just be there as a bridge. And it's really great to be involved in that. And some people really accept it or want it, and some it just flows really naturally, and some it's really challenging. So we always have to work at that. Yeah. So it's interesting you
Yeah.
mentioned so few advisors do build that into their practice. I would think it would be key, but I don't know if you have thoughts around that, or, or even why people are so resistant. It's just a lot of, yeah, the challenges of life, I guess. But
Yeah, I think it's similar for advisors, right? Why do you not build intergenerational wealth planning into your practice? It may be that it's uncomfortable for you, right? Maybe you don't feel comfortable having these kinds of conversations or opening the space up to your clients. But when you take a step back and think about the benefits, right? Increased retention of your top clients. If you like working with a client, odds are you'll enjoy working with their children. And so why wouldn't you want to have that inbred sort of referral network for yourself and build your practice so that it becomes an intergenerational practice that I would think would be much more rewarding for the advisor as well. So I think there's a little bit of confusion around how to do this. I think there's also this inherent fear of overstepping, right? And this isn't really my place. I don't need to be the one to do this. But again, when you take a step back and think about what the advisor can really do to earn a fee in today's commoditized landscape, this is a perfect example of a service that you can provide to families where you open up space for them to really have these guiding, meaningful conversations that just get missed in the day to day. And you say, I'll do it tomorrow, or I'll do it in 6 months. And then that never happens. And so I keep coming back to the idea that you were sharing a little bit ago, Robert, the fact that it would be a disservice essentially not to at least offer this to your clients. If they don't want to do it, that's perfectly fine. but it's opening up the space. And I think oftentimes it can be very overcomplicated, let's say, in terms of, I don't know how to do it. I don't know when to do it. I don't know what to say. When really it can be pretty simple, right? You can make it part of your process. You can offer clients a family meeting and explain to them why it's important, right? I mean, financial planning cannot be done with one person alone because that one person, that client exists in a system of some kind. They don't exist in a vacuum. And you were mentioning right before bringing a client's wife or a client's husband into the discussion. Their financial decisions impact others, largely their families. And we just, as a culture, don't acknowledge this fact nearly enough. I think, advisors can even just normalize these conversations for their clients. They can be the ones to model the ability to do something uncomfortable in the service of avoiding regret in the future. I think what you were saying earlier is essentially, I see this as part of my responsibility, or I'm not doing my job well if I don't broach this topic. And then it really comes down to engaging the next generation and advisors having the eyes to see that, this generation actually wants something different. They can get top market advice, top market outlooks anywhere. They can get that on the internet immediately. So that's really not the service that they're looking for. They're not looking for performance because that's easy to get. They're looking for more of a holistic guide, right? Someone who can educate them, who can talk to them about the specific questions that are on their minds. And I think that acknowledging the fact that there is a different need that is coming from this generation, I think is really important too. You mentioned some generations that are older, right? And they lived through different experiences. They grew up listening to Depression era stories. They lived through the Cold War. They lived through the tech crisis, the housing bubble. They just have a totally different lived experience than the generation that will be inheriting the wealth. And so I think sometimes there can be blinders to the fact that this generation wants more than simply good performance. They want someone who can actually help them when it comes to their own lives and the big questions that they have when it comes to their finances.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had a lot of that. I've tried to open up a sort of a process, just make myself available, let clients know that that's there if they're thinking about it when they're ready. A process where if they have children or adult children, just offer, hey, spend some time with your mom or your dad's financial advisor. So I'll just, I'll get on the phone or meet with them, someone who's 22 or just graduating college or, so it's been amazing. I shared a book called The Wealthiest Man in Babylon, which is a real simple story, just kind of about the power of compounding growth with a client's, I think he was like about 18 years old, just graduating college high school, going on to college. And, the client told me that his kid read it in, like a day and was just fascinated. So and I put a little note saying you'll probably learn more in this book than about financial planning and compound growth than you could ever learn. So just read this, but also the engagement. So, looking for those kinds of things. I'm even dealing with my own children right now. I've got a son, he's 23, just graduated college, just sent me a photo the other day. He's up in Northern California. He sent me he's working, thank goodness, after graduation. He's got a pretty good job. He's in more of the research field and environmental science and water and stuff like that. I'd love it if he wanted to come into my practice, but he let me know that's not his plan B, C, D, or E, or even R or Q.
Yeah.
So,
nope.
But he sent me a picture of his first office, real office that he had. It was set up real nice. And then I had set up a Roth IRA. He had done his own Roth IRA. So he wants to talk about that and understand how that works. So it's great. So it's kind of forcing me to make that transition. And with his that he did on his own, he had sort of done some research, which was pretty good, through internet and AI and stuff like that. And I sort of shared, well, we can go, let me walk you through my process, just some outline, just so how that would run through it. So you could have, quote, expert advice here just to get it and set him up. So I wanted to just show him the process, that there is a process, but he wasn't too far off, and I myself grew up. I remember my first real professional job, where I was getting a salary and some benefits, and was actually some money going into a, like a retirement type account, like a 401k, and watching the compound growth and kind of getting pretty early on that you should probably max that out and just, but with some power and some guidance of how to allocate it. But having those conversations,
Right.
I'm still doing it with my own child, but I understand it can be a little harder at times. And sometimes in the next generation, they see things so differently. I mean, my daughter just does not want to have this conversation whatsoever. So maybe later in life, and they just see things. There's a big generational divide. It's unbelievable. But sometimes I can be that third party who isn't their parent talking to them. And you know how that goes. Sometimes you can have more effectiveness on a friend's kid than you can have with your own, oddly enough, but not uncommon. So, but I really enjoy that process. And just to let you know, I'm not charging for it if we already have a relationship. And even if they have something really small, I'm happy to answer their questions. They're in the family, they're in, So it's a big service, and to say, hey, I'm going to sit down and share my thoughts and whatever it is, career or, work ethic or process or, all these things, not just say get them a summer internship, but all their thought, happy to do that. And sometimes they're not just, they might be a 69-year-old adult too, who's going to transition into some stuff later in life, and we can help prepare them, so.
Right. No, I mean, it's such a great point that you bring up too, the idea of just ask me anything. If you're my client, your family's my prospective client, right? And treating heirs like prospective clients, not like your client's children, but as someone who you consider part of your business if you're working with your clients. And I think what's really interesting to me is that some of the things you mentioned are so simple, right? You send a book with a note in it. That's a great idea to connect with someone. And it's not pushy, right? It's not too much. It's great. And it's a way to just reach out and let them know that you're there. And I think too, even something as simple as how does an IRA work, right? So many of these things, our culture and our society does not teach. Like we don't teach, right? Student loans, 401ks, insurance. How does insurance work? I have my health plan, life insurance, the power, to your point, of investing small amounts early. You can almost include something like a first job financial checklist, right? You have a client whose kid, is going to start working, and just hand them this and say, if they have any questions, this is such an overwhelming time. Let me know if I can be of service. And it's these small things that really end up making a difference. And I think I just can't stress enough how much the upcoming generations who are inheriting large sums of wealth really are looking for education, and they really crave it. And the advisor is in a really unique position to provide that. And it can be in the form of a workshop, an educational event, a webinar, whatever it might be. And your client forwards it on to their child, adulting 101, whatever you want to call it, right? It's just, it is really helpful. And it's a area that I think a lot of people are hesitant to dip into.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, you're really helping them, and most everybody wants to help their kids, or, even adult kids. I'm talking people in their 50s or 60s. So if you can smooth that over and make it easier and kind of ease their burden on, they've done a great job, but they just want to make sure, if they're going to step out at some point that they can't control, that all that work and that legacy will be passed to someone who's prepared to take it on and guided and sort of coached with the partner who they can rely on. And you say, ask anything. That's totally my policy. Ask me anything. We call it open kitchen concept, thinking to these restaurants, you look right in the kitchen, you can see everything they're chopping up. There's no, weird stuff like that back there. Hey, I do got to ask, as we start to kind of wrap a little bit and wind down, your work in the financial world, but now you're a therapist. So what do you see in common, or talk about how that is, maybe what's in common, what's different? Is there overlap? Do they relate? And that's an interesting pivot to go there. I'm I am kind of putting on the therapist hat at times. There's just, especially when the markets are highly volatile, but also just life stuff, when they're looking at the news, boy, you hear, people can really get, whereas you want to be centered, they can get very uncentered. Let's put it that way, and knocked off track. It comes up a lot. Yeah.
For sure. And you talk about people getting knocked off track, right? I mean, you help clients build wealth, accumulate assets, save as much as they can over their lifetime, and then fail to discuss this with their family. And then it passes in a generation, right? They spend their lives working for something that they ultimately don't protect, and a legacy that they ultimately don't protect. So I guess for me, I'd say avoidance of difficult conversations is just what strikes me over and over and over again. I see it in this line of work with intergenerational wealth transfers, and I see it in everyday life, right? Avoiding the big conversations that just feel too uncomfortable or too painful or whatever it might be. But the thing and the thread that really runs through that is that once you figure out that you can handle the emotional discomfort, you can make yourself uncomfortable, there is almost always a massive sense of relief, which is one of the most powerful emotions. And so the more someone can push themselves towards their discomfort, the better their life tends to be. I think that truly is something that I see running through so many different threads just of life and within the business world. I think too, the desire for control, right? Coupled with the fear of letting go. Financially older generations may struggle to let go of financial control, even when they do have trust established with their families. I think clients in the therapy room resist change, even when they know it's necessary, because that's why they're coming. Why else would you be in therapy? Letting go of a relationship, an old coping strategy, whatever it might be. And two, just thinking about money, right? The idea that inheritance is more than money, right? Inheritance carries emotional weight, expectations, guilt, obligation. I think in the same way that people inherit beliefs, they inherit coping strategies, they inherit ways of being, often unconsciously too, right, from their families. And the way that we deal with money is passed down. So if we don't talk about it, and then the next generation inherits it and never talks about it, it's very unlikely that it'll be sustained for generations to come. So, there's so many different threads that I think I could go down, but those are some of the bigger ones that stick out to me.
Yeah, it's just so interesting. I try to make a practice of doing uncomfortable things, so at least once a day. I believe there's a book called The Comfort Crisis. Have you heard of this? I've heard.
Yes. Is that by Michael Easter?
It could be. I've heard of it. I haven't read it. I hear it's terrific, but we live in this creature, of just comfort crisis, right? Let's just order our groceries at Amazon, go to the door, Grubhub. What do we really need to do? Everything's available, but how often do we get at, I like to surf and go in the ocean. So even where it's cold, and part of it is just to jump into some really cold water or something it's uncomfortable, you're getting smacked around and but every once in a while you need it just to sort of reground and, or other things, maybe emotionally uncomfortable. You talk about people resist that. But I think I've been in a prior podcast. It was quite some time ago. You guys want to look it up. I don't know with my guest is named PJ Nestler, and he talked about limiting beliefs. He's kind of like a high level trainer who's dealt with a lot of Navy SEALs and special forces and pro athletes. But, I had some of my own that he helped me work through that were and I think everybody has them, but he, if you ever want to go back and hear that episode, he talked about a process for that. And it was really, really interesting to me. So they all tie together with that kind of work. And we kind of like to help people and just partner with them, to help them with these things. And, families are complicated, right? There's a lot of, not everything's perfect everywhere, some of their kids are having big mental health challenges or, whatnot. Sometimes you have to step into that messy middle and deal with it, or be sensitive to that. So I'm sure you see it. It's concerning, but I guess we'll have to work through it as a society. But we're here to help. And this conversation's been great. Anything else you want to maybe stress, or points that hadn't come out yet, or things as we start to kind of wind up, but just, curious what else you have, or if there's anything that didn't come up you think's worth sharing.
No, I think we hit a lot. I think for me, the biggest point when it comes to this work and why I find it so exciting is that there are really simple things that can be done to make huge differences for families. And I originally would think, these things are so obvious. We don't even need to be talking about them, right? Of course, you should be doing this. Of course, you should be having these conversations. But then when you look at the statistics and you realize how few people actually do these things, I think it's just remembering that avoidance is what kills the opportunity to connect. It's what fosters regret for people later on in life. And if you're able to handle that emotional discomfort, and again, what we were talking about, doing it simply, right? Sending a book, offering a phone call where you can ask anything, open kitchen, whatever you want to call it. But they're really small things that you can do that move the needle in massive ways. So not overcomplicating these things, not thinking them through in 500 different ways or twisting your mind into a pretzel before you open your mouth to have the conversation. It really doesn't need to be that difficult. So I think just simplicity where possible, and acknowledging that these are facts of life. And while we don't like talking about things like change or mortality or power or responsibility, no one wants to take responsibility for their own lives, right? I think that's another common theme that you see running through the therapy room and through this work, right? People do not want to take responsibility for the fact that we have an internal locus of control, right? We can control our own lives. We make our own choices. And people, while that's beautiful in so many ways, people resist it in so many ways because it's scary, right? But the idea is that we really don't want to avoid so many of these simple truths. And we want to take responsibility for the fact that we've worked really hard, right, to build this wealth. You as advisors have helped clients do that. And you don't want to watch them let it go. So you want to step in, you want to gently refocus them where you can. And if clients hear what you have to say and they choose not to, that's their choice. And that's totally fine. But it's opening the door to having these conversations that I think is really important.
Yeah, that's so you find that a common theme. People ultimately don't want to take responsibility as what it boils to, or make the change. Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, it's just such a fascinating topic. I mean, I just want to let folks know I'm there. Some folks are probably listening to this are fully engaging that, and that's terrific. Others, if that could help you. Early on, I picked up a family early in my career where single child, let's see, probably in his 40s, was set to inherit a pretty good sized estate. The father was an attorney, stuff scattered everywhere, drew up his own trust that left half to charity according to Schedule A in the trust, and Schedule A was a blank document. And then the guy passed, the wife passed. It ended up going to court. No one could figure this thing out. The courts decided he ended up getting most of the money, thank goodness, because it was so unclear. There's a process where the attorney general steps in on behalf of a state to try and get it for charities, but it was done so horribly from an attorney. And I guess my point in all this long-winded story, I'm thinking if I could see that guy, it's like, what in the world were you, the kid, they never had a bad relationship with the kid. Did you hate him? What were you thinking? So, I get with these folks that are patriarchs, and it's like at a certain point, just step up and deal with things and make it clean and make it simple for them. And you're going to be fine. But if you leave it just a total mess, it's like, it's a real pain when you got to clean these things up, and they're already dealing with emotional issues and loss. And so now you're going to force them to deal with a big nightmare. We had another, this has gone way too long, but there's another podcast I just want to reference. We did a couple of years back with a woman who she was the lead anchor newscaster in Minneapolis, and she lost her husband, who was a former professional tennis player and a highly successful attorney. We've had her on twice. And at any rate, she assumed everything had been done and taken care of. Well, nothing had been done. And it created a nightmare. And so she had to figure it out all on her own. And she wrote kind of a best-selling book that was sort of an estate planning for dummies. But just because she went through such a traumatic thing and she never understood. Right. And so she lost the love of her life. She was grieving, but she was really pissed off at her former, husband lover because he left it in a complete shambles. So I didn't mean to give more horrors. So those are extreme, but they happen. And so I think that just came down to taking responsibility, and he should have known. And so when we see those kind of things, I try and be a leader to step in and say, hey, what are you trying to achieve? Let's do some other good here where we can. And hopefully they're ready to hear that. And we're effective at connecting with them where they can move forward. But most of the time it happens. Sometimes it doesn't. We try. Yeah. So, yeah.
Right. And that's all you can do is try, right? As the advisor, you're in this very unique position where you have a window into the family's world. You work extensively with your client. And so all you can do is try and gently try to refocus them and encourage them to have these conversations. But there are so many ways that you can do it, and you can do it thoughtfully. And when you think about how many different routes there are to encouraging your families and your clients to have these conversations, not doing it really is doing them a disservice. And it's doing you a disservice as a financial advisor too, if you want to continue growing your business with the kinds of clients that you enjoy working with.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we can help in any way, let us know. We're always trying. I'm hoping this podcast, I'm thinking it gave people a lot to think about. Really appreciate you as a resource. Your work in this world of financial, but also on the therapist, they really intersect and overlap, and it's fascinating. So really appreciate you coming on, Natasha. This was great. And thanks again. And to everyone listening, please like, share, make it a great day. And we're thrilled you're here, and I hope you're getting some value out of this. Make it a great day, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Millionaire Next Door podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Signature Estate and Investment Advisors or Royal Alliance Associates Incorporated, member FINRA SIPC. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.
All investing involves risk. Past performance does not indicate future results. Specific products discussed are not suitable for all investors.